Welcome to our webinar, Putting the Fat into Milk Fat. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, editor of Hoard's Dairyman, and a member of the editorial team that also publishes Hay and Forage Grower and the Journal of Nutrient Management. We are broadcasting from the Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Hoard & Sons Company building commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Hoard. Our Putting the Fat in Milk Fat webcast is sponsored by Cotton Incorporated, and we will discuss how to maximize milk fat by feeding whole cottonseed. When it comes to feed ingredients, our company has deep roots with testing rations with different feed ingredients. As our magazine's founder, William Dempster Hoard, was determined to find ways to improve milk fat and other components at the Hoard's Dairyman Farm, where we milk cows to this very day. In fact, W.D. Hoard penned this quote in 1899, right about the time he bought the Hoard's Dairyman Farm regarding cottonseed. This cottonseed meal is a new thing in this state, and that state, of course, was Wisconsin, but I have been engaged in outside dairy work for several years and have seen considerable of it in New England and other places. This webinar session will feature one speaker, that's Dr. Kevin Harvatine. Following the presentation, we will open up the show to audience questions. If you have a question for Kevin, please type it into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will address those later in the second half of the webcast. So let's start out with our first poll question. What is your primary feeding goal on your operation? Your options are going to be increased milk fat percentage, increased fat yield and protein yield, increase milk production, and increase overall animal health or other. So go ahead and answer that poll question here. What is your primary feeding goal of your operation? Increase milk fat percent, increase fat yield and protein yield, increase milk production, increase overall animal health, or other. So we'll give everybody a couple more, 5 to 10 more seconds to answer that poll. And so we're getting, well, you guys are quick today. So we're at 70% of the audience participation. So the top response is increased fat yield and protein yield, followed closely by increased milk production and increased milk fat. So those are some interesting results, and I'm sure Kevin will share some commentary on that poll. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kevin Harvatine, who is a university researcher at Penn State University and a Dairy Advisory Council member for Cotton Incorporated. Cotton Incorporated has helped fund some of Kevin's research, which is the basis for this presentation. Thank you for joining us, Kevin, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you for having me. So it's fun to be here. I grew up reading Hoard's Dairyman, growing up on the family dairy farm in Northeast Pennsylvania, and I still read Hoard's Dairyman to this day to keep up on everything going on in the industry. So it's fun to be here in a bit of a different form, but interacting with the Hoard's group. So what I want to start out with is kind of some thoughts on adapting to historic times. So, you know, if you think back, the dairy industry's been extremely dynamic, especially over my career, the last 20 years. But really, we've had all these other changes that have been occurring since the pandemic started. So I kind of wanted to throw some of these out there and kind of seed your thinking. And we're going to talk about what I think you should be thinking about in relation to milk fat in improving profitability in each of these. So the first thing is, in parts of the country, we have production quotas, limits, reductions, whatever you want to call them. Most of these are based on pounds of milk, not components. I know there are a few on components, but the ones that are based on milk yield, there's extra value to watching fat and protein percent. We have very high feed prices right now, so feed efficiency becomes a bigger player in profitability, and especially fat has become expensive as a nutrient and harder to get. The next is that milk fat price is high. Now I always laugh that most of my work is around milk fat, so as soon as milk protein price goes above milk fat, people say, well, I don't care about milk fat proteins more. And now we have the opposite. Milk fat's higher than milk protein. People start saying, well, I just care about fat and not protein. Really, you can have both. And our goal should be to make both as much as we can and to make it in a profitable way. So I think we have to think about our marginal cost and our marginal profit. And I would argue that that hopefully we're still profitable on milk protein, especially depending on how you're calculating out your fixed cost. If we're already paying for that cow to make the milk fat, the milk protein then is quite profitable, right? So you still can't lose much milk yield trying to increase these components, and I'll show you some data on that. And then the last is, I think we really have to think about long and short term about managing our dairies. And I totally appreciate we have to survive the month, we have to survive the next 6 months in the year, but then we also want to be in the best position to be profitable 1 to 5 years from now, right? So we have to make sure we're making the right short-term decisions to maximize profitability today, but also make sure that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot, that we want to be in the right spot for the future, right? So we need to think about that short and long-term decisions. We want to be making both in the right way. Okay, so one thing I wanted to start out talking about too is this price of fat. So both edible and inedible oils have become expensive. I know all of our feed ingredients have become expensive, right? But our oil ingredients especially have increased in price. Now, my crystal ball has become really cloudy, especially since the pandemic, right? So are we going to have long-term high prices for fat? If you start looking at some of the changes that have occurred, the pandemic put all of these supply chain issues into place. But at the same time, we've had a lot more interest in biodiesel and renewable fuels, and we have a number of legislative things that have come in to increase their production. So if we look at that, we probably are going into a future where we have more competition from renewable fuels, and they are going to be using tallow that we normally have been feeding to cows. They're going to be putting pressure on our oil seeds and our oilseed oils. So I think that's a little bit of a change that has been kind of a couple things stacked on top of each other over the last year. But if we think out longer term, the fat in our diets is probably going to be more expensive relative to our other feeds. So I always like to start out talking about the cash flow coming onto the dairy. And if we think about what is actually paying the bills, mostly it's fat and protein yield. So a number of ways to look at this. We could plot out fat per percent per fat dollars per pound and protein dollars per pound, but cows are always making more fat, or hopefully they're always making more fat than protein. So the way I like to look at this is what's our cash flow of dollars per head per day, plotting this out for an 85-pound cow, 3.9 fat, 3.1 protein. And if we look at over time, the red and the blue lines is fat and protein for our average international market. That's where most of the dollars returning to the farm are coming from. Our other solids, which is the lactose and the water that's going along with that and the minerals, we're not getting paid very much for that. And you could argue that a lot of times we're actually paying more to truck that than what we're actually getting paid for it. The other thing is that we are paying to make that lactose. That's an expensive thing for the cow to do. And that's okay as long as she's making fat and protein to go along with it. But we really don't want to be making extra lactose. I will say that this varies across the country. So I know if you're in the southeastern part of the US, we have a fluid market that doesn't pay at all for protein. You know, look at your milk check and make sure what are you getting paid for? And that needs to be where you need to focus on. But for most of us, it's going to be fat and protein yield. So I liked in our first poll question that most of you are on track for this and you're targeting fat plus protein yield. That's really great goal for us to be tracking that because it links to our profitability, right? The thing I'll add on to that, and I started adding this on because we have trucking costs increasing and we have in a lot of places quota. At the same time, we need to beat average fat and protein concentration. So I would add that as a secondary goal. Yes, track your fat and protein pounds, and that's your main goal, right? But at the same time, I want to be above average fat and protein because if we're managing correctly, we should be able to do both, have maximal yield, but also be doing that in a way that's going to be more profitable because we're not going to be making any more lactose. We're not going to be trucking any more water than what we have to. So what is a 0.1 unit increase in fat or protein worth? Well, it depends on your production level. So that at the top, I'm just plotting out for 240 a pound, which is about an average protein and fat value over, say, the past 5 years. At an 80-pound herd, that's 20 cents per cow per day, $72 per year. This changes depending on the value for fat or protein, right? So I think we're about $3.50 or so for fat right now. So that would be putting us at about 28 cents per cow per day is what the value is if you can increase fat by that 0.1 units. So I show this just to give you an idea of how much can you spend, what can you invest, and still be able to get that return, because some things you're going to do, you're probably going to have to make a little bit of an investment. But again, the best thing to do is to take your numbers, what are you getting paid right now, and you can calculate out if I can get this much production, what's the value going to be returned to me. Now, really, we want to keep focused on yields, right? And yield is a matter of milk yield and milk fat percent. And I have this 3D contour to show you that you're influenced by both. So we want to keep our goals based on that fat plus protein yield or fat yield, but there's two different ways to get there, right? So when we're looking at the bulk tank and we're looking at our fat percents, we need to be careful to make sure we're calculating out that yield. And what we often see is people kind of get carried away and they want to see that high fat percent, but they don't realize that if that comes at a cost of production, they may not be ending up ahead at the end of the day, right? So I just ran a little scenario at the bottom that if you're going from fat plus protein percent of 7% going to a 7.1, at 80 pounds, that's 5.6 pounds of components. You go to the 7.1, you're 5.68. If we get a 1.1 pound increase in milk yield, we get the same increase in component yield, right? We are going to be paying extra to ship that milk and those extra costs, but we're getting the same fat plus protein yield. Now, if we can do both, we get that extra bump there. But what we want to look at is that 0.1 unit change in milk components is equal to a little bit over a pound of milk. So when we start looking to increase fat and protein percents, we have to be really careful. We can't hurt milk yield very much, or we're not going to have a net benefits. So I think you guys are on the right track. Keep your eye on yields, but you have to do that calculation yourself because the bulk tank and your creamery report are coming as pounds and percents, right? So what should you be thinking about to maximize milk fat yield? The first thing we need to do is to set our goal. What should we be making, right? We need to take into account the seasonal pattern, and I'm going to show you some data on genetics. We next balance the diet, and this is where the nutritionist is taking the lead, putting that diet together. But the thing is, they're limited by what feed ingredients are available on the farm. So we're going to talk a lot about unsaturated fat, diet fermentability. There's also an influence of fiber digestibility, fat supply, and a number of feed additives that can help us out there. Next, we're going to manage the feeding system. So we need to mix that diet right, we need to deliver it, and we need feed available all the time. I'm not going to spend time talking about it today, but there's really important influence of how cows eat across the day. And if those cows are without feed for 6 hours a day, and they're really hungry when they're coming to the bunk, they're going to eat a lot of feed, and you're going to throw off that rumen, right? So we need to have the right diet, but we also need to be managing it and making sure those cows are eating more evenly across the day. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to monitor and adjust. So you're going to watch milk fat concentration. You get that from your creamery all the time. You get that from your DHI testing. You can also look at de novo fatty acids. So there's a new method where the machine that's testing for milk fat concentration can also predict these fatty acids less than 16 carbon that are made in the mammary gland. Really interesting to watch, can give you an indication if things are changing, and it's good extra data to look at. I'm also going to show you the time course for changes in milk fat when we get into a milk fat depression issue. Okay, we're on to poll question number 2.
Thanks, Kevin. And you talked about multiple component pricing. You talked a little bit about butter, fat, and protein. So obviously, and you shared that the milk in the Southeast order is basically paid on pounds of milk, but 92% of the U.S. dairy producers get paid on basically fat and protein and a few other things, because that's the amount of milk covered in the multiple component pricing system. And so this is a big important topic. So we're going to go to this second poll question, and the poll question reads like this: where do you find the most reliable information about nutrition? Internet, social media, dairy magazines, print publications, research journals, industry events, or other farmers? So go ahead and answer that one, and we'll give everybody a little bit of time to do that. And remind everyone, as you hear from Kevin, if you have a question, you can ask a question in the GoToWebinar control panel. Go ahead and type that in, and we will see that here. So we're just crossing the 50% mark here. So let's see what everybody's thinking here. Topping the list is research journals, and then dairy magazines and print publications would be second there. So let's turn it back to you, Kevin, and learn more about the nutritional factors involving milk fat.
We should have had Horde's webinars in this list. That would have been the winner for sure today.
Exactly.
Okay, so a lot of our interest in my lab is understanding what regulates milk fat production. And I kind of see the world as nutritional factors and then non-nutritional factors, because I'm a nutritionist, and that's how I look at the world, right? But to look at these non-nutritional factors first, we use these to set our goal for what should milk fat be. So genetics, season of the year are going to be big influences there. There's an effect of time of day. You can have 0.6, 0.8 unit differences in milk fat concentration from one milking to the next, depending on your milking intervals and your feeding times, in some influences there. There's stage of lactation, that those peak cows just make less milk fat and protein than our later lactation cows. There's also some influences from parity. On the nutrition side, the things that we can change now, these non-nutritional factors are kind of hard to change, right? They're more set. Maybe we can change them in the long term, but for right now, they're kind of set. On the nutrition side, we talk about decreasing milk fat through diet-induced, or what I call biohydrogenation-induced milk fat depression. So this is where we get too much unsaturated fat, have too much starch, too much fermentability in that diet. We start causing acidosis. It throws out the rumen microbial population, and we reduce milk fat. The other thing that we have been studying a lot more for the last half dozen years is that we can increase milk fat a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, by providing more of what the cow needs to make milk fat. So we can get more acetate that we get from fiber digestibility. Acetate is the main substrate that a cow uses to make milk fat. We also have dietary fat, and specifically palmitic acid would give us the biggest effect. That one's kind of easy to understand. The cow needs some fat to make milk fat. So if you provide her more, you can get a little bit of bump in some situations. So first, go over some of these non-nutritional factors. The first is the seasonal rhythm. So this is the Northeast milk market over 20 years, and you can really see a really clear repeating pattern. Highest milk fat and protein January 1, lowest July 1, about 0.25 units of fat, 0.2 units of protein. I don't want to say that there's not an influence of heat stress. Heat stress has a really big effect on our cows, but to me, this is too consistent to be heat stress. And I think it's that cow responding to changes in day length over the year. You have lengthening, shortening days. I always joke that the birds know to fly north and fly south. How do they know to do that? Well, it's because of that changes in daylight across the year. So our key takeaway is we should not expect the same fat January 1 as July 1. We should be changing our goal across the year. And we have two problems. The one thing I find is that if people have the same goal across the year, they're hitting their nutritionist over the head with the baseball bat in the summer saying, what have you messed up? We're lower in fat, when maybe that's exactly where they should be. On the other side of it, they may be happy in January when they shouldn't be, that they should be expecting a little bit more than they're getting, right? So we should change that goal across the year. The other thing that's interesting is that there's a seasonal rhythm for milk yield, but it is a different timing to that rhythm. So milk yield peaks late March, early April. So that's lining up with our equinox. The low point is later in September. We do have some differences across the country. So for milk per fat percent, we see a larger rhythm in the north than we do in the south. It's the opposite for milk yield, that we see a less of a rhythm in the north, so showing Pennsylvania, Minnesota in this graph, and we see more of a difference across the year in the south, so Florida and Texas. Again, there's another influence of heat stress, but I think that's separate. We have the seasonal pattern, then we have an effect of heat stress. So we want to be trying to manage both of those. The other thing is that we've been having a big change in milk fat concentration over the last 10 years. So I know Hordes has published the data going back to 1960. From 1960 to about 2010, we were right about 365, 37 milk fat. Now, since 2010, we've been on this linear increase. Blue is showing the Northeast milk market. I like the Northeast milk market because we do not have a lot of Jerseys and crossbreds coming in versus our other milk markets. And then contrasting that with Florida, which is also more of a Holstein market. They're not being paid a lot for their components, but they also have a lot of additional challenges, environmental challenges, nutritional challenges, very different diets. So I like to show this, that our cows have the potential for higher milk fat if we're managing for them for that, but there's a big influence of environmental effects. The one takeaway from this is that you should have a different goal for milk fat today than you did 10 years ago. And I run into a lot of situations where people say, well, I'm at a 3.8, I'm fine. Well, maybe you're not. If it's January 1, you should be at a 4.15, right? So in that case, maybe you actually have some milk fat depression. So if you think back to when our average was a 3.7, if you were at a 3.4, you were getting pretty excited that you had milk fat depression, right? 0.3 units below your expectation. We should be similarly getting excited about that 0.3 unit decrease, but we need to, again, accurately set our goal. We should be knowing our cows should be doing better and taking that seasonal rhythm into effect. So why is this? Why are cows making more milk fat? Well, if we look at genetic potential, the genetic potential for milk fat percent has increased 0.17 units in 10 years. Milk fat yield has increased 106 pounds over that period. What it is we used to breed for increased milk fat yield through just increasing milk yield, right? So from 1980 to 2010 in that bottom graph, we were gaining pounds of fat, but we're doing it through milk yield. Since 2010, they've changed the equations, and this is being driven by both an increase in yield, but also more of an increase in fat percent. So let's talk a little bit about nutrition. We have diet-induced milk fat depression. I call it biohydrogenation-induced because it's biohydrogenation intermediates made in the rumen that cause the problem. So what happens is we get unstable rumen fermentation, we get synthesis of bioactive fatty acids by those rumen microbes. Those are trans 10 intermediates. They can reduce milk fat up to 50%, and there's probably cows on farms out there that are reduced up to 50% by this. Hopefully the whole farm is not reduced that much. We do that at the university, but hopefully the farm never has that happen. When this occurs, you see a greater decrease in those de novo fatty acids, those less than 16 carbon fatty acids. So that's one place where if we're monitoring both milk fat percent and de novo fatty acids, we could kind of pick up on that change. I will just warn a little bit on de novo fatty acids. There is a seasonal rhythm to them, just like we have a seasonal rhythm in milk fat percent. So if you're watching those, you should take that into consideration. The other thing is that you can also decrease de novo fatty acids just by adding additional fat to the diet. So if you start feeding a fat supplement, you'd expect that number to go down. So milk fat depression is a common cause of decreases in milk fat. It's not meant to explain every change in milk fat that occurs on the farm, but I would say if you have a cow that changes over 0.3 percentage units, or if you have a herd that changes over 0.3 percentage units, it is likely diet-induced milk fat depression. Now, smaller changes could be from fiber digestibility driving from that acetate supply. By adding a fat supplement, you can increase milk fat, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 units. But beyond that, if you have changes beyond that scope, it's going to be milk fat depression. I wanted to quickly show the time course of milk fat depression. So we did an experiment. We had control cows fed a normal diet, and then we put cows on a low forage, high oil diet, and we progressively decreased milk fat over 7 to 10 days. You can see we had almost a 50% reduction in milk fat in this experiment. Cows stayed low. I've never seen cows recover on their own from milk fat depression. It's a long-term issue. We took those cows and we switched them back to that normal diet. And on the bottom, you can see in red, they progressively increased, and it really took about 15 days, 18 days for them to be the same or exactly the same as those control cows. On the right, I'm just showing that bioactive trans 10 fatty acid that when you get milk fat depression, that trans intermediate goes up. You correct it, that trans intermediate goes down, and that cow recovers. So what it is that if you have a problem on the herd, you can look back, something that changed 7 to 10 days ago. That's probably not the only factor, but that's the straw that broke the camel's back. If you start making changes, usually we make small incremental changes to try to fix the problem, you should see things moving in the right direction 7 to 10 days. If you don't, you either did not pick the right thing or you did not change it enough. You better go back to the drawing board. You don't have to wait a month. This is going to happen rather quickly. It's going to be fixed rather quickly, not by tomorrow, but 10, 14 days, you should see it moving in the right direction. Our dogma is that this is caused by changes in microbial population. So just wanted to show you 2 of those. So we looked at total fungi and then one of our fibrolytic microbes. And you can see that by day 4 on that bad diet, we've pretty much wiped these communities out. And we go back on that safe diet, 8 to 12 days, they're recovering quite nicely. So our idea is that we're changing a microbial population that changes what's being produced, has an impact on that cow. Remember, we feed the microbes that then feed the cow. So we must manage risk factors that cause milk fat depression. These risk factors are the things that add energy to our diet. They're things that help us make more milk, right? So we can't eliminate them. We can't eliminate risk, we manage risk. Top of this list is dietary fat, both the profile and the rate of availability. Diet fermentability is also really important. So carbohydrate profile, starch level, rate and extent of fermentation, also an influence of effective fiber. Feeding strategies and management, we don't want those cows slug feeding. Anything that gives us acidosis is going to be an issue. Rumen modifiers, so ionophores are a risk factor. They're not going to cause on their own. I like the benefit of ionophores, but they are a risk factor. Silage fermentation and quality, high yeast count forages will drop milk fat from this problem. I see more issues with high corn silage diets than high haylage diets. And the last is an individual cow effect, that high producing cows eat more feed, turns up that rate of passage in the rumen, and we see more problems with those high producing cows. So these unsaturated fatty acids are really a huge risk factor, and that's 2 parts. They're changing the microbial population, but they are also what we make these bioactive fatty acids out of, right? So we want to look at the fatty acid profile. In 18.2 is 2 times more of an issue than 18.1 and 18.3. 18.2 is the main fatty acid we're going to find in corn and soybean. The issue here is that 18.2 is actually directly leading to production of those bioactive fatty acids. The other thing that's really important is the rate of availability of those fatty acids. And the extremes that I like to talk about here are cottonseed versus distiller grains. So I think everybody at some point has had a bad experience with distiller grains, especially long ago when we had higher fat distiller grains. Well, if we look at cottonseed is almost 20% fat and the same concentration of 18.2 as distiller grains. Distiller grains, even high fat distiller grains, were 12%, right? But why were they causing so much of an issue? Well, the distiller grains, the oil is actually in the solubles that get dumped back on the grains and then dried down. So the oil in distiller grains is actually like feeding a free oil. It's very rapidly available in the rumen. Versus cottonseed, that fatty acid's within the whole cottonseed, so it's protected within that seed coat. So it's slowly coming out. I shouldn't say it's protected because it doesn't make it out of the rumen. The rumen microbes get it. They biohydrogenate that unsaturated fat, but it's so slowly being released, and that cottonseed stays in the rumen so long that it doesn't cause a huge disruption. It's not all available at one time. So again, we have to look at not just what is the amount of unsaturated fat in the diet, but what are the sources? And we can feed more unsaturated fat if it's coming from these more slowly available sources. So why do we risk feeding fat? We increase energy density, support milk yield and body weight gain without causing acidosis, because if we increase starch, we put ourselves at the risk of acidosis. Supporting milk fat yield. So sometimes cows can make up for a low fat diet by making more fatty acids themselves, but sometimes they cannot. And that's something we're really trying to investigate right now. And we would like to say that there's an exact amount of fat that you have to feed to meet these cows' needs for fat and optimize milk fat yield. But we don't have a number for that. And I don't think we're gonna actually ever come up with one exact number, because there's kind of this interacting influence. What I will say is that if you start decreasing the amount of fat in that diet, you better have really good forages and really good forage digestibility, because the cow is going to need the acetate to make that fat herself to make up for that. Okay, so but our safer situation is to feed a moderate fat diet so that we're not asking the cow to make all of that fat herself. So how do I think about feeding fat? You know, you make your diet, your forages, your corn grain, all of that has a little bit of fat in it. So that's going to bring you to about 2.5, almost 3% fat in the diet. Now you start wanting to increase fat above that. I look for what I call rumen available and economical sources of fat. And cottonseed is going to be a major player there. So it's available in the rumen, it's unsaturated fat, but again, that fat from cottonseed is more slowly available and it's going to be rather safe in the rumen. Once you get a certain amount of that, and the exact level of that is going to depend on the rest of your diet, but you're going to hit a limit where you say, if I increase more rumen available fat, I'm going to be at a big risk for milk fat depression. So then you're going to start feeding rumen inert fats, and generally those are quite expensive, right? So our goal would be to look at our basal diet. How much fat do I have there? Bring in cottonseed. And then once you hit your limit, then if you want to feed more fat, you start bringing in that dry fat supplement. Okay, so our next question.
To our third poll question here. What is your primary source of rumen available fat in rations? Distillers grains, whole cottonseed, roasted soybeans, tallow, or others? So go ahead and answer that question here, and that'll give Kevin a little bit of perspective as he continues on with the webcast here. So go ahead and answer that. We're pushing the 50% mark. We'll give everybody a little bit of time yet, and remind everyone that if you have a question, go ahead and enter that into the GoToWebinar control panel. So now we're pushing 2/3 here. So let's see what the audience is saying. Distillers grains tops the list, followed by cottonseed, actually right as they were listed there, cold cottonseed and roasted soybeans. So Kevin, let's talk a little bit of cottonseed here.
Yep. Let's and one just quick comment. Distillers. What's interesting is over time they've been stealing the fat out of our distiller grains, right? And at first we were complaining about that fat because it's so rumen available. But as we get these higher oil prices, we've been seeing that the amount of fat that's coming from distillers go down. Okay, so a little bit of background on cottonseed. So this is a true byproduct. And it's something great we can talk about our industry, right? Is that we use these byproducts and we turn these byproducts into really nutritious human food. But this is very much a byproduct. It's driven by fiber demand. People are not planting cotton to sell you cottonseed. They're planting cotton to sell for the fiber. It's harvested in bales in late summer and fall. Bales are ginned and the fibers removed. And then the cottonseed's sold directly from the gin while processing, or it's put into storage and then sold across the year. So depending where you're at, you might have local supply if you're in places where cottonseed's grown, so south, southeast, and the west. It's going to be trucked into the Northeast. It comes up the Mississippi into the Midwest. So we're all aware of our supply chain issues, right? And you may have experienced some of those issues getting trucks or being able to get barges in over the past 2 years. Just really want to quickly show the acres of cotton that's being produced. So since 2008, it bounces around, but really it's been kind of a stable amount of cottonseed that's being produced. So if you think about people buying cotton-based clothes, there's a lot of competition from other synthetic things like that. Their market has been a little bit more stable. The other thing to mention is that there's a large impact of weather on these crops, both from being too dry in areas where they have dryland cotton. So I know this year that there's a big loss of cottonseed in Texas because it just dried up and stopped growing. But then the other thing is you have some of this in hurricane areas. So if bad weather comes in during that harvest, they can also lose cotton during harvest. The other thing, there's going to be some influence on corn and soybean prices that, depending on what people think is most profitable for them, some acres will move. The other side of this on the demand side is that the dairy industry is the major player as far as demand for feeding whole cottonseed.
So that brings us to our next poll question. How much would you say you know about whole cottonseed? So we got 3 options here: minimal understanding of the product, general level of understanding of the product, expert level understanding of the product. And I think this is important to because we want to customize this talk and presentation a little bit here. So we'll go ahead and see where everybody's at here. And strong response here. We're right in the middle here. So that should help you out a little bit, Kevin, as we talk about the next parts of cottonseed.
Yeah, sounds great. And the one thing I kind of find a little bit on cottonseed is that as an industry, we have a lot of experience with it, right? But then I'm not sure if we're in some cases we're always feeding it, and we might not think too much about it one way or the other. But it's kind of good to kind of challenge your thinking and think, where am I using this, and how can I optimize the use? So things to consider when feeding whole cottonseed. The first one that I like to highlight is variation in moisture. So, I asked quite a few people, do you do moistures on your cottonseed? And I don't run into very many people that do. So it's not going to be as variable as our corn silage bunk, right? But I think it's something to kind of keep an eye on and run a few and see how consistent your supplies are. 2 parts of that. You really want to make sure that it's in your system as the right number, so that the right diet is getting out in front of those cows. The other thing is, I think this can kind of fine tune what is the value to this. So if I'm running a little bit lower dry matters, I can get a good buy on that. Just those margins make a difference, right? It's going to be more variable and higher coming straight out of the gin in the fall. It should be more consistent coming out of storage, because there should be some quality control, making sure what's going into storage is dry enough that it's going to be good during storage. There's big variation in analysis. There is a new grinding method at both Dairyland and Dairyland was the first to do this, and I think Cumberland Valley is now also offering it. And it's showing in this bottom picture what the problem is in the lab. So you have whole cottonseed, and if we throw whole cottonseed in the normal grinders that we use for grinding forages, you get what you see in the middle, which I call a rat's nest. So literally you have this clump of fiber, and when you pick that up, you have all of the ground up seed parts that fall out of it. So if you think about the person at the lab trying to weigh out 0.5 gram of this and getting representative sample, it is nearly impossible to do, right? So we get a lot of analytical issue because we don't have a homogeneous sample. So this new grinding method gives us a really good grind, and that's what's being shown on the right. So I'm hoping that over time we can get a little bit better handle on the true nutrient variation if we can do a better job in the lab. So if we look at the NASEM, the new nutrient requirements, the dairy cattle book, they have fatty acid concentration in cottonseed at 18%, crude protein at 23%, and NDF at 50%. But then if you look at the standard deviations, and this is on over 1,200 samples, standard deviation for fat concentration is 2.4%. So if you think about plus or minus 2 standard deviations is where 80% of our samples are going to be. There's going to be there's variation there, but like I said, we really don't know how much of that is true variation between loads and how much of this is actually our lab variation. But these book values are kind of the best guess that we have, or the best estimates that we have for that nutrient value. Cumberland Valley Lab in 2018, they had 166 samples that they averaged 17.9% fat on. So today I'm going to talk quite a bit about the fat side because that's where I'm thinking about it. But when you're feeding cottonseed, you have to also value the crude protein and NDF part of this. If we look at fatty acid profile, it's going to be really consistent within cottonseed. There'd be no reason to be worrying about doing fatty acid profiles of cottonseed. Just wanted to point out the fatty acids we're really watching in our dairy diets. Palmitic acid, it's higher than soybeans, a little bit higher than corn products. It would be equal to tallow, not as high as calcium salts of palm or our palm fatty acids, but it's going to be bringing in some grams of palmitic acid. 18.2, the fatty acid that we're watching for milk fat depression, it's the same as corn and soybean, but it's so much slower availability in the rumen, it's going to be less risk for milk fat depression. So why do you feed and how do we value cottonseed? Well, the fiber part, the NDF, it's good effective fiber. That's going to be valued as a forage replacer. On the protein side, it's rumen available protein. So that's going to be replacing canola, soybean meal, alfalfa, distiller grains in the diet. And then on the fat side, that's going to be energy and specifically fatty acids. And I think before we were just talking about it as energy, but I do think we're trying to hit a certain target for fat as a nutrient, right? So there it's going to replace tallow, roasted soybeans, part of our dry fat supplements because it is a safer form of fat, right? So you could look at these individually and say, how much soybean would I replace? How much tallow, and piece it together in your scenario. There's also some ways through the Sesame program that came out of Ohio State that it can look at what's the value, crude protein, energy, and effective NDF combined together, and it can give you what is a good market value or a good nutrient value that you can compare to the market value to determine if it's a good buy for you or not. Quickly, we wanted to talk about the response to feeding cottonseed. So there's considerable older data, and that's a lot of data from the 1980s. Those were lower producing cows. Much of that focused on feeding maximal rates or determining what the maximal rate of cottonseed would be. So based on that, common recommendation is less than 15%, and that's based on the gospel toxicity levels. I think you can go a little bit above that. Just depends on exactly how much is going to be detoxified, but 15% is a pretty good safe rule of thumb. There's a recent meta-analysis from Michigan State that, again, was mostly this older data. What they see is no effect on intake or milk yield, an increase in milk fat and protein yield. We did 2 experiments at Penn State recently. The first one, we were titrating from 3 to 10% cottonseed in first lactation cows or in multiparous cows. So showing the average of all in the first data line and then the first lactation in those second plus. We had no effect on milk yield, also no effect on dry matter intake. When we look at milk fat, it was interesting that in the first lactation cows, we actually got some milk fat depression when we went to 3% cottonseed. So these cows were on the edge already, 3.5, they went to a 2.8. But then as we added cottonseed, we actually increased milk fat. The multiparous cows had no problems. They stayed at 4% milk fat. So those cows did take that extra fat that we were giving them and put it into milk fat, but they were able to make up without it with the milk, with making fatty acids from scratch. We did a second experiment. We did this in multiparous cows at 15% fat, or sorry, 15% cottonseed, no effect on milk yield, but we did increase milk fat percent from a 3.9 to a 4.08, and that was also able to increase milk fat yield in that experiment. So this is going to depend if you're getting a fat response or not. It's a little bit variable in the literature, and it's going to depend probably the fat level of your diet and where the cows are as far as if they need that fat or if they're able to make up for that low fat diet. We also get questions about cottonseed passing in the feces. So we wet sieved the feces and calculated the percent of seeds passed and the percent of fat that we lost in those seeds that passed. And what we saw is a big difference between our parities. So the first lactation cows were 1% of seeds passing, and it did not change as we fed more cottonseed. Our second and late lactation and greater were about 4% of the seeds passing whole, but that didn't change as we fed more cottonseed. So it's interesting to think that those first lactation cows, their rumen is working a little bit differently. It's keeping that cottonseed in the rumen, not letting it pass undigested. There's probably going to be other interactions depending on the fiber level and the particle size and how that cottonseed gets trapped and stays in the rumen. But overall, it's generally a low percent.
Well, let's go to our final poll question here, Kevin. What is the main driver for you to include whole cottonseed in your rations? Low forage availability, competitive price, milk fat response, milk yield response, or nutrition composition? So go ahead and answer that. And we'll also do a last call. If you got questions, go ahead and type those into the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll get those answered shortly here. So let's see what the audience had to say. In the number, we got a lot of items actually coming very close. Nutrient composition, milk fat response, and competitive price were all leading in that poll there, Kevin. So floor is yours.
And I think that might actually be a good indication that people are looking at the situation on the farm and what's important to them and using cottonseed in the way that's most important to them. And that's really interesting about cottonseed because you have multiple nutrients and multiple things that it can bring to that diet. Okay, so I wanted to wrap up to just say what I think is a good approach to this. I really think nutrition management is best practice as an experiment in progress. The cows are not wrong. The computer program might be, right? So what do we do? First, accurately and precisely set your goals, count for the seasonal effect, make sure you're looking at daily averages because those milkings can vary. When milk fat's acceptable, include these risk factors. They decrease our cost, increase efficiency, increase production. When milk fat's low, look for a reason. Again, that's 7 to 10 days. Those high producing cows are going to be more susceptible. Look at those as being the leading indicator. When you make the right diet changes, you're going to be able to make pretty quick recoveries. So 7 to 10 days, you should see things moving in the right direction. Look at dietary polyunsaturated fatty acids first, so concentration of 18.2 and also the source. Remember, rate of rumen availability is probably the most important factor here. Cottonseed is very slow rate of rumen availability. It's going to be safer than our other fat sources. Looking at diet fermentability, this is going to really vary depending on your type of diets. There's data to show that sugars can be beneficial, so you might want to add a little bit of sugar, stimulate certain microbial populations. So you start to titrate down starch, increasing forage NDF and effective fiber. Again, cottonseed can be a source of both of those. Switch rapidly fermentable starch for less rapidly fermentable, but you have to be careful because you can start to lose milk. Rumen modifiers, Rumensin is a risk factor, but doesn't cause on its own. It's going to interact with these other risk factors. There's data to show that DCAD, so by feeding buffers, helps for milk fat. HMTBA, so methionine analog, we also have done a lot of work to show that it decreases risk for milk fat depression. And there's some nice mechanisms for yeast and direct fed microbials depending on your situation. The challenge is you're dealing with a lot of interactions in that rumen. Think about how you're feeding those cows and how those cows are eating. We want them to eat more evenly across the day. They can slug feed TMR, and that's a big problem. Saturated fat supplements, especially palmitic acid supplements, can increase milk fat, but we don't want to be using those as a band-aid because we know if you have milk fat depression, they're going to be less efficient, right? Monitor milk yield and milk fat over time. Have realistic expectations for the time required to see changes. Again, reasonably rapid. 10 days, you should see things going in the right direction. It's going to be 21 days before you get your full effect. So let's review. Goal is a high energy diet that maintains normal rumen fermentation. Focus on fat and protein pounds, and you're already doing that, right? Minimize milk fat depression, provide enough fat to support milk fat production. Cottonseed can provide that economical source of fat that's slowly released to the rumen. Again, a constant experiment in progress to optimize for your situation, your diets, your cows. Have to recognize the folks in the lab that do the hard work, so current and former lab members. We've greatly benefited from funding, both from USDA and a number of industry and commodity board groups, including Cotton Incorporated. Thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions.
So we got a number of questions coming in here. We're going to start with the first one, Kevin. Is the Sesame program treating the energy value of cottonseed equal to other energy sources such as corn or forage? And the person asking the question notes that fat is different.
Yeah, so my understanding of this is it's calculating a net energy value for those feeds, and it's basically calculating $1 per unit of net energy. So the net energy of fat is higher, so it's taking that into account. And so what Sesame does is, like, basically you put in the market prices for what you know the feeds you can get. So you're basically saying, if I'm not going to feed cottonseed, I'm going to buy corn grain and soybean meal, and it's going to calculate out the value for energy and protein from those, and then say, okay, within the cottonseed, the protein's worth so much, the energy's worth so much.
So we have an organic producer on the line here as well, and he shares, we are concerned about pesticide residue and/or GMO and issues with cottonseed, and that impacts, of course, organic milk production. Is there cottonseed available for the organic sector? And what might be, and if there is, what's the availability?
Yeah, so I know I had a quick discussion about this sometime in the past, but I hate to say I don't remember the exact answer to it. So there is some organic cotton production out there. Obviously, you see some organic cotton products being sold. I'm not sure how much of that is domestic production versus international production, but and I think that's probably mostly ending up in local use. that it's probably hard to get that if you're a distance away from the production, because it's just segregating that's difficult over that long haul.
So I think a lot of the research you presented, Kevin, was on Holsteins. Does this change, does the research or data change at all when you consider a color breed such as Jersey by chance?
Yeah, it's great question. I think the principles of milk fat are pretty much the same for Jerseys and in Holsteins. We don't have a lot of data on Jerseys, and we definitely don't have much data that directly compares on the same types of diets. But I think we have, Jerseys clearly can get diet-induced milk fat depression. They have higher fat yields relative to their other milk components. So you could almost think that they're probably a little bit more on the edge as far as requiring dietary fat to make that. But I think the principles are going to be very applicable.
Mm-hmm. So you've done a lot of work with cottonseed and, with the Penn State herd as well. So, out of the feed additives out there, why is whole cottonseed a good option in rations?
Yeah, so why I've always liked cottonseed is the slow rate of fatty acid availability in the rumen. So my interest and expertise is on the fat side. So that's kind of where my mind always goes. But the value I've always seen is that slow rate of release doesn't overwhelm the rumen microbes. So that allows us to feed that economical rumen available fat without issue. So, we had a lot of people mentioning distiller grains, and in a way, I think we've scared people about unsaturated fat because there's so many bad experiences with distiller grains. We need some fat in that diet, but the problem is when you start titrating in with distiller grains, you're going to run into a problem much faster than you are when you titrate in with cottonseed.
This question just came in here, and it's kind of a big picture, but do you have a feel on the value of cotton split up between like fiber for clothing, oil, meal, and whole cottonseed, like either in dollar value or percent of total pounds?
So I don't want to throw out a number, but it is very small. So my understanding is actually some of this. So people will let the gin keep the seed, and that pays for the gin processing the seed, or at least part of it. I should have a better number, but it is a small part of the value relative to the fiber.
Mm-hmm. So there's a number of dairy producers on this webcast today, and so where would you've studied this topic quite a bit, Kevin, and where would a dairy producer or nutritionist turn to get some more information on cottonseed?
Yeah, so I would direct the Cottonseed Incorporated has a website that kind of is a central place to give information about cottonseed, and also kind of link up with where to find cottonseed. That would be one place. The other thing I would say, I would direct producers to have a discussion with their nutritionist, and that local knowledge is going to be really valuable, just because the supply chain is going to be a little bit different in different areas. And also kind of just have experience in how cottonseed works in local diets. So if you're running, we differ so much in how we feed cows across the country. And again, just since cottonseed has those different attributes, it's bringing in fat, but it's also providing some of that effective fiber and protein. There's going to be probably a little bit of a different approach that nutritionists would use, bringing that in as far as what what am I taking out? Because whenever we make dietary changes, it's a substitution. It's not just an add on top.
Well, thanks a lot, Kevin. We want to thank you, Kevin, for your insightful insight and response to the questions as well from our audience. If anyone in the audience has additional questions, I'm sure Kevin and the team at Cotton Incorporated would be happy to answer them. So you can go ahead and set those, send those to us if you have additional ones. And once again, thanks, Kevin, for being with us today, and equally importantly here, Cotton Incorporated for their sponsorship of this program. We hope you all make plans to attend another webcast in the future. And from our production crew here at Hoard's Dairymen, Caitlin Allen and Michaela King, I want to thank everyone for attending, and until next time, I wish you all a good day and take care.